All right, so this video is going to begin Module 2A, which is intended to review and supplement Chapter 5 of your textbook, which provides a review of short-term and working memory. And in this particular video, we're going to talk about the modal model, which is one of the most famous models that cognitive psychologists have posited as far as how our ordinary memory system works. Okay, so the modal model is part of what is called the information processing approach, which developed as a result of the cognitive revolution, right? So in this particular approach, the information processing approach attempts to use a computer as a metaphor for how the mind works, right? So I have different stages up here, but basically if we were to attempt to understand how memory works using a computer as an analogy or analog, it might look something like this, right? So your PC acquires or receives input from a keyboard or mouse. It converts the symbols into a special numeric code, in this case binary code. It saves the information on a hard drive, CD, or disk, and then it retrieves the data from the disk to be displayed on the screen, or it sends it to the printer, right? And if your computer crashes for any reason, or if there's not enough room on the disk, or if a file is deleted or you give the wrong command, the information becomes inaccessible or forgotten, right? So by looking at how a PC works, we can already see kind of obvious parallels to how we might understand our memory system, right? We have really three processes that are already becoming evident. We have encoding, or getting information into our memory. We have storage, which is maintaining information in our memory. And we have retrieval, which is getting information out of our memory. Okay, so this is the modal model, and it should look familiar to most of you. And it's called the modal model because it was basically just a mashup or a combination of all of the features of many, many different information processing models of memory. So it took aspects of many different theories about how memory works under that information processing approach and put them together, right? So a mode is the most frequent example or value for a given category, right? So the modal model is the most frequently proposed information processing model of memory, or it has aspects of the most common information processing models of memory. Okay. So again, this should look familiar to most of you, but it was proposed by the researchers Atkinson and Shiffrin in 1968. And basically it posits that there are three different memory stores. So first we have sensory memory. So sensory memory is going to store all of the information that's acquired through the senses. So what you see, what you hear, even what you touch, anything that enters into your sensory register is going to be maintained in sensory memory, or anything that enters into your sensory modalities is going to be registered in your sensory memory. It's almost like your brain takes a brief snapshot of all of the information that's being acquired through the senses, but it's very, very brief. So we say that the capacity of sensory memory is unlimited in that whatever information you can acquire through your senses, that information is going to be registered in sensory memory. However, the duration is extremely brief, right? So it's a snapshot of everything that comes in through the senses, but it's rapidly forgotten. So as you'll see in later videos, sensory memory is forgotten almost in the order of seconds. So the longest duration for sensory memory, depending on the sensory modality, is going to be around 4 to 15 seconds at the very most. And 1 second or even fractions of a second is going to be more typical, right? So sensory memory takes in all of the information acquired through the senses and holds it for a very brief second or fraction of a second. And then whatever information you deem to be important, or whatever information you decide to pay attention to, that information is going to be transferred from sensory memory to short-term memory. So short-term memory is, again, sensations that you pay attention to, okay, are going to be transferred from sensory memory. And unlike sensory memory, short-term memory is going to have a very limited capacity. So you're only capable of holding between 4 and 7 units of information in your memory at a time, in your short-term memory at a time. And the duration of short-term memory is usually around 20 to 30 seconds. Okay? So first, all the information acquired through your senses is going to be briefly registered in sensory memory. And then whatever information you pay attention to or deem to be important is going to be transferred to short-term memory. But the capacity of short-term memory is extremely limited in that it can only hold between 4 and 7 units of information. And that information is only going to stay in your short-term memory for around 20 to 30 seconds unless you engage in something called rehearsal. So rehearsal is essentially saying the information to yourself over and over again, right? So just like you would if you were trying to remember a phone number or a credit card number, right? In order to keep that information accessible in your mind, if you say it over and over again to yourself, that rehearsal process is going to keep it in your short-term memory. And according to Atkinson and Shiffrin, that rehearsal process is also going to allow you to transfer it to your long-term memory. So if you rehearse the information enough, according to Atkinson and Shiffrin, it's going to end up in your long-term memory. And your long-term memory, unlike short-term memory and sensory memory, is a permanent storage system. So it's a permanent storage system with an unlimited capacity, okay? And it's also what most people are talking about when they talk about memory is long-term memory. And when I say unlimited capacity, various mathematicians and cognitive scientists have attempted to estimate how much information is actually stored in your long-term memory throughout your life. And many different scientists have come to the same conclusion, which is that the average person stores 500 times more information in their lifetime, in their long-term memory, than what's in the Encyclopedia Britannica, right? So for any given person, at the end of their life, in their long-term memory, they have stored 500 times the information that's accessible in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Okay? So obviously there are different conditions that make it very, very difficult for us to retrieve that information. But using various indices, they have demonstrated that it is available to us. We're just not always, or it is stored in our memories. We're just not always able to retrieve it. So one thing I do want to note about this is that Atkinson and Shiffrin say that if you want to transfer information from short-term memory to long-term memory, all you have to do is engage in that rehearsal process where you're saying the information to yourself over and over again. But more recent research has suggested that this maintenance rehearsal idea is not sufficient for creating long-term memories. So you're going to have to do a lot more than just say the information to yourself if you want to be able to access information long-term. And the best strategies you can use we'll talk about in the next module. But generally speaking, what we call elaborative rehearsal is going to be more effective for creating long-lasting, long-term memories. So when I say elaborative rehearsal, essentially what I mean is thinking about the meaning of things, thinking about what information means rather than simply saying it aloud to yourself over and over and over again. Okay? So if you think about the meaning or semantic content of information, what that does is it allows you to apply that information to stuff that's already in your long-term memory, right? So if you take new incoming information and relate it to stuff that's already in your long-term memory, that's going to ensure that you're able to access that information later on, rather than simply saying that information over and over to yourself in what's called maintenance rehearsal. So just to recap, in Atkinson and Shiffrin's modal model, they talk about two different features. So the first feature is what we call structural features, and that's just the architecture of memory or how the memory system is organized, right? So we would say in this case that the structural features are just the different memory stores, the sensory memory store, the short-term memory store, and the long-term memory store. And then they also distinguish between structural features and what are called control processes, which are just activities occurring within the memory system that allow the information to be retained in each of the memory stores and also to pass through each of the memory stores, right? So we have rehearsal, or maintenance rehearsal, which we just talked about. We have strategies to make the stimulus more memorable. So we have elaborative rehearsal, which I just talked about, associating that new incoming information with pre-existing information that already resides in your long-term memory. And we also have the strategies of attention, right, that allow you to focus on stimuli. So we've already talked about the fact that everything comes into your sensory memory, but it just registers there for a very, very brief period of time. So in order for information to not be rapidly forgotten, you have to actually pay attention to it or focus on it for it to go from sensory memory to short-term memory, right? So that attentional process is going to be just as important, if not more important, than the elaborative and maintenance rehearsal control processes. Okay, so I'm just going to run through really quickly the same example that's in your book, just to kind of bring home how this might work. So we have Rachel here, and Rachel is preparing to order pizza from her favorite restaurant, like all of us are now, ordering from our favorite restaurants. So she logs on to her favorite restaurant's website, and as soon as she looks at that screen, all of that information is going to be temporarily registered in her sensory memory. And I should bring up at this point that we can actually distinguish between 3 different types of sensory memory. So whenever we talk about visual information, that's iconic sensory memory. And then when we talk about auditory information, that's echoic sensory memory. So like echoic sensory memory. And then when we talk about touch, information related to touch or tactile information, we call that haptic sensory memory. So Haptic. And those are just, again, different memory stores depending on the particular sensory modality, right? So in this case, we're talking about Rachel's iconic sensory memory. So she logs on to papajohns.com or Pizza Hut or whatever her favorite website is, and all of the information on the web page on her computer screen is going to be registered in her sensory memory. And at this point, instead of ordering online, Rachel decides to dial the number on her phone. So at that point, she would focus her attentional processes on that particular phone number, okay? So because she's engaging in that attentional strategy, that's going to transfer the information from sensory memory to short-term memory. And let's suppose that her phone is across the room. So she now has to get up from her desk and walk across the room to her phone, right? So to keep that information in her short-term memory while she's retrieving her phone, she would rehearse the number over and over again, saying it to herself. And that's going to keep it into short-term memory. Okay. And then, because Rachel knows that maintenance rehearsal, or saying it to herself over and over again, right, isn't going to be sufficient to move it into long-term memory, okay, maybe she engages in other processes to keep that information in long-term memory. Maybe she relates it to other sequences of numbers that she knows, right? So engaging in that elaborative rehearsal strategy where she relates that new incoming information to old information, that's going to transfer it to long-term memory. And then the next time she wants to order pizza, she's going to successfully retrieve the number from long-term memory, and it's going to go back into short-term memory because, again, her attention is now focused on the information, which is going to keep it registered in short-term memory, and she's going to dial the number, right? So I didn't say that before, but essentially part of the model is that there's constantly sort of an interchange between long-term memory and short-term memory. Anything that is currently registered in your long-term memory can go back into short-term memory whenever it's currently the subject of your attention or whenever it's currently in your awareness. Okay? All right, so that is just a very brief summary of the modal model and each of its components, both the structural features and the control features. And I will pick this up. We'll look at each of these memory stores in more detail. So I will discuss sensory memory in more detail with you guys in my next video. Okay?